I always thought our life was predictable, but in a good way. Jane and I had been married for 7 years, living a comfortable life in the suburbs. I worked as a financial analyst, mostly from home, while Jane was a freelance graphic designer. She claimed the flexibility suited her, and it allowed her to keep her independence. We shared a quirky morning ritual. I'd make her coffee while she read the news on her phone. Then, as I got ready for work, she'd insist on driving herself to meet clients or attend meetings. "I don't want to bother you," she'd always say, even though I had a car sitting idle in the garage. At first, I thought nothing of it. Jane enjoyed her autonomy, and I respected that. She always said she found taking taxis therapeutic, a time to think and decompress. It was odd, but we all have our little quirks. It was one of those cool autumn mornings when she grabbed her purse, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "I've got a meeting downtown, so I'll take a taxi. I'll see you tonight." "Why not take the car?" I asked, sipping my coffee. "Parking's a nightmare down there," she replied quickly, brushing me off with a practiced smile. Little did I know, this ordinary routine held secrets I couldn't begin to fathom. As the weeks passed, Jane's reliance on taxis began to stand out more. At first, I chalked it up to her personality. She loved convenience and hated driving in heavy traffic. But then, I started to notice inconsistencies. For example, she'd leave saying she had meetings in parts of town that were easy to park in. Yet, when I offered to drive her or suggested she use the car, she'd always come up with an excuse. "I might have to hop between places," she'd say, or "the lot fills up too quickly." One day, I asked casually, "Do you ever use the same taxi company? We could look into a regular service. It might save some money." Her answer was quick, almost too quick. "Oh, I just use the app. Whoever's closest shows up." But something didn't sit right. Her tone was dismissive, and she changed the subject before I could press further. That evening, while she was out, I decided to check our joint account. I was curious to see how much she was spending on these frequent rides. Scrolling through the bank statement, I found dozens of small, repeated charges to ride-hailing apps and taxi services. Nothing outrageous, but oddly frequent. Sometimes, 2 charges were made on the same day, morning and late afternoon. The odd part? The receipts had timestamps for hours when she was supposedly working from home. I shrugged it off for the moment. Maybe she wasn't sharing every detail of her day, and why should she? I didn't want to be the kind of husband who monitored her movements like a hawk. Relationships were built on trust, or so I thought. That night, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I brought it up casually. "Hey, I noticed a lot of taxi rides on our account lately. Been busy?" Her response felt rehearsed. "Oh yeah, some of my clients are really scattered, so I've had to go out more. Plus, you know how I am about public transport. Crowded buses freak me out." I nodded, trying to suppress the nagging feeling that her answers didn't fully add up. Little did I know, the truth would begin to surface in ways I couldn't have imagined. It was a Thursday afternoon when I received a peculiar call from Jane. She rarely contacted me during the day unless it was urgent, so I answered immediately, expecting some emergency. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice unusually cheerful. "I'm running late, so don't worry if you don't see me at home until later tonight. Just a long client meeting. You know how it goes." "Of course," I said, though I couldn't ignore the unusual brightness in her tone. Jane didn't usually sound this upbeat after client meetings. She often came home drained and ready to vent. "Are you all right?" I asked. "Totally fine," she chirped. "I'll grab dinner on the way back." Something in her delivery seemed off. Jane rarely skipped dinner at home. She enjoyed cooking as a way to unwind after work. I hung up feeling unsettled, but pushed the thought aside. Maybe she was just in a good mood. A welcome change, I figured. Later that evening, as I waited for her to return, I couldn't shake the sense that something didn't add up. Out of boredom, I pulled up the ride-hailing app we shared and checked the history. Most of the recent rides were short distances within the city, nothing out of the ordinary. But her latest trip caught my eye. Her pickup location was nowhere near the address she'd mentioned earlier in the day. Instead, it was on the far edge of town near a small industrial park. And the destination wasn't downtown, where she said her meeting was. It was to a residential neighborhood I didn't recognize. I stared at the screen, puzzled. Why would Jane be in that part of town? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I reasoned with myself. Maybe the app glitched, or maybe she had a last-minute errand. When Jane finally returned that evening, she was all smiles. She walked in humming softly, kissed me on the forehead, and dropped a takeaway bag on the counter. "I brought us dessert," she said, beaming. I wanted to ask about the odd ride but decided against it. If I was overthinking, it would make me look paranoid. Instead, I smiled and thanked her for the treat. But as we ate, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen and quickly flipped it face down. The buzzing continued. A second notification. "Work?" I asked casually. "Just spam," she replied, not meeting my eyes. That night, while she slept, I checked the ride app again. I needed to understand why my gut was screaming that something wasn't right. For the first time, I realized Jane might not be as predictable as I'd believed. The following morning, I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. Jane acted completely normal, cheerful, chatty, even a bit flirtatious over breakfast. It felt almost too normal, like she was overcompensating for something. After she left for another client meeting, I decided to do something I hadn't done before. I opened the ride-hailing app again to double-check the details of her recent trips. Sure enough, there it was. Yesterday's ride had indeed ended at that unfamiliar residential neighborhood. I scrolled further back through the ride history and noticed a pattern. Every couple of days, Jane was taking taxis to that same area. Sometimes it was during her work hours, and other times, she claimed to be out shopping or running errands. What struck me most was the consistency of the pickup locations. They weren't random. She was always starting her trips from areas well away from where she said she would be. It was as if she didn't want me to connect the dots. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. It could have been innocent, couldn't it? Maybe she had a friend she hadn't mentioned, or a side project she was working on. But then again, Jane wasn't the type to withhold details. At least, she hadn't been before. Later that day, I took a break from work to get some fresh air and ran into our neighbor, Mrs. Harris. She was in her garden, watering her roses, and waved me over with a warm smile. "You're home a lot these days, aren't you?" she asked, a knowing twinkle in her eye. I laughed. "Perks of working remotely. What about you? How's retirement treating you?" "Oh, same old, she replied. Though I've been seeing Jane out and about more than usual lately. I swear, that girl is busier than a bee, always hopping in and out of taxis. Her words lingered with me long after our conversation. Mrs. Harris was sharp and observant. She didn't miss much. If she'd noticed Jane's frequent taxi rides, then maybe there was more to them than I wanted to believe. That evening, I decided to test the waters. While we were having dinner, I brought up the topic of our neighbors, casually mentioning Mrs. Harris and her roses. "She said she sees you all the time," I added. "Says you're always rushing into taxis." Jane froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a laugh. "Oh, Mrs. Harris and her gossip. I swear, she probably thinks I'm running an international spy ring." She brushed it off so easily, but that fleeting pause didn't escape me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. The weekend arrived, and Jane suggested we go out for dinner. She said it had been too long since we'd spent quality time together. While I appreciated the gesture, I couldn't help but feel her suggestion was meant to distract me from something. Over dinner, she was as charming as ever, filling the conversation with light anecdotes about her week. But I noticed she was being vague, avoiding specifics when I asked about her work or clients. "So, what's this big project you've been working on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Jane hesitated briefly before smiling. "Oh, just some branding work for a new startup. Nothing too exciting." "What's the company called?" I pressed. She blinked, and her expression faltered just enough for me to catch it. It's called Lark & Finch, a boutique design studio." The way she stumbled over her words didn't feel right. Jane was always articulate, especially when it came to her work. But I let it go for now. When we got home, she excused herself to take a shower. I sat in the living room, my mind spinning. Something was gnawing at me, urging me to dig deeper. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for Lark & Finch. If it was a boutique design studio, there should be some trace of it online, a website, social media presence, anything. But after 20 minutes of searching, I found nothing. No company by that name existed. My stomach churned. Jane had lied. Later that night, as we sat in bed, I tried again. I looked up Lark and Finch. I couldn't find much about them online. Jane didn't even look up from her book. Oh, that's because they're super new. They're just getting started, so they haven't done much marketing yet. Her response was so smooth, so rehearsed, that I almost believed her. Almost. But as I lay awake that night, I replayed her words in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. Jane was hiding something. What I didn't know was how deep the rabbit hole went, or how much worse the truth would be. By Monday morning, the growing unease was too much to ignore. Jane's inconsistencies and evasiveness were piling up. But instead of confronting her outright, I decided to take a more subtle approach. That afternoon, Jane left the house for another one of her client meetings. I waited until she was gone, then checked the ride-hailing app again. Sure enough, she booked another taxi. This time, the destination wasn't the mysterious residential neighborhood. It was a coffee shop downtown. I decided to follow her. I grabbed my car keys and drove to the coffee shop, parking a short distance away. As I watched from across the street, I saw Jane step out of a taxi, looking immaculate in a fitted blazer and heels. She glanced around briefly, as if checking for someone, then walked inside. My heart raced. Was I being paranoid? Maybe she really was meeting a client, and I was reading too much into things. I decided to wait, hoping I'd see her greet someone, perhaps this elusive client from Lark and Finch. But after half an hour, she reappeared alone. She wasn't holding any paperwork or her laptop, just a to-go coffee cup. That's when it happened. As Jane walked toward the street, a man in a taxi waved at her from the curb. She smiled, an intimate, knowing smile, and walked over to the car. The driver leaned out the window and said something that made her laugh, her hand brushing against his arm briefly before she climbed into the back seat. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. The way she interacted with him was far too casual, too familiar. This wasn't just a stranger driving her from point A to point B. I stayed frozen in my car, watching as the taxi pulled away. It didn't turn toward our neighborhood. It headed in the opposite direction, toward the outskirts of the city. I knew I couldn't follow them without being noticed, so I pulled up the app instead. Within minutes, I saw the ride appear in the trip history. The destination? That same residential neighborhood from before. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as a realization began to form. This wasn't a random coincidence. This driver was part of something bigger. When Jane returned home later that evening, she was radiant, humming a tune under her breath as she set her purse down. I played along, pretending everything was fine, but inside, I was already planning my next move. Who was this taxi driver, and why did Jane seem so comfortable with him? Whatever the answer, I knew it was time to dig deeper. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The connection between Jane and the taxi driver felt too intimate, too deliberate. I decided to investigate further. Using the ride-hailing app, I carefully reviewed every recent trip Jane had taken. One particular name caught my attention, D. Malik. This was the driver who had picked her up the previous day. It wasn't the first time his name appeared in her ride history. In fact, it showed up far more often than seemed coincidental. Curiosity burned through me. Who was this man, and why did Jane seem to favor him? I had no idea where to start, but then an idea struck me. The app had a driver profile section, complete with a photo and a brief description. I clicked on his profile, and there he was, a man in his late 30s with a friendly smile. The profile listed his years of experience and a stellar rating. But it wasn't his credentials that interested me, it was his route history. From the app, I could see that most of his rides with Jane started or ended at one of two locations: our home or that same residential neighborhood I'd noticed before. I decided to do something bold. I booked a ride with him under my own name, choosing a pickup point far enough from home that he wouldn't recognize me right away. When his car pulled up to the curb, my heart pounded. This was the man I'd seen with Jane just yesterday. I climbed into the back seat, forcing a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said cheerfully, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Afternoon," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We drove in silence for the first few minutes, but I couldn't help studying him. He was charismatic, with an easy demeanor that likely made passengers feel at ease. It was no wonder Jane had warmed to him, if warming up was all it had been. As we neared my chosen drop-off point, I decided to test the waters. "You seem familiar," I said casually. "Do you often drive in this area?" He chuckled. "Oh, all over the city, really. It's a great way to meet new people." "Ever have regular passengers?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There's one lady I see often. She's really nice. Always tips well. She's got great taste in coffee, too. Likes to bring me a cup when she's in a good mood." The blood drained from my face. He was talking about Jane. There was no mistaking it. I forced a laugh and muttered something vague, pretending to be distracted by my phone. When we reached the drop-off, I thanked him and stepped out of the car. My mind raced as I watched him drive away. Jane wasn't just taking taxis to save time. She had built a rapport with this man, one that felt far more personal than I was comfortable with. For now, I had more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary driver-passenger relationship. After the unsettling ride with D. Malik, I knew I couldn't sit idly by any longer. There was something between him and Jane, and I had to find out what. The problem was, I had no idea where to start. If I asked Jane directly, she'd deny everything or spin another story. I needed evidence. That night, as Jane slept soundly beside me, I made a decision. I would hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, even invasive, but I couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something serious was happening behind my back. The next day, during my lunch break, I contacted a local PI firm I'd found online. The investigator I was assigned, an older man named Greg, listened carefully as I explained the situation. He asked detailed questions about Jane's habits, her recent taxi rides, and the strange destinations I'd noticed. "She's meeting someone," Greg said bluntly when I finished. "Could be the driver, could be someone else. Either way, we'll find out." I handed over everything I had, screenshots from the ride-hailing app, her frequent destinations, and even a photo of D. Malik's driver profile. Greg assured me he'd start immediately, tailing Jane and digging into the driver's background. The waiting was agonizing. Every time Jane left the house, I felt my stomach twist in knots, wondering what Greg might discover. At home, she was her usual self, warm, affectionate, and attentive. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a facade. 3 days later, Greg called. "I've got something," he said, his tone grave. He arranged to meet me at a coffee shop to share his findings. When I arrived, he slid a manila envelope across the table. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were several photos, each more damning than the last. The first showed Jane getting into Malik's taxi. The second was of them at the same residential neighborhood I'd noticed before, standing outside a modest-looking townhouse. They were laughing, her hand resting casually on his arm. The final photo made my chest tighten. It was of Jane and Malik inside the townhouse, visible through a slightly ajar window. They weren't just chatting. They were close, intimately close. The kind of closeness that left no room for misinterpretation. Greg's voice broke through my haze. "I followed them for 3 days. This wasn't a one-off meeting. She's been seeing him regularly, usually at that address. The guy's clean, no criminal record. But their relationship isn't purely professional." I stared at the photos, my mind racing. Every doubt I tried to suppress came crashing down. Jane was cheating on me, and now I had proof. But the worst part was yet to come. Greg leaned in, his voice lowering. "There's more. She's not just meeting him there. She's meeting others too." "What?" I whispered, barely able to process his words. "She's been taking rides with multiple drivers, meeting different men at the same address. It's unusual, to say the least." Unusual didn't begin to describe it. My wife wasn't just having an affair. She was tangled in something far more complicated. And I had no idea where this revelation would lead. Greg's revelation left me shaken. Jane wasn't just seeing one man. She was involved with multiple drivers, each linked to the same residential address. My mind swirled with questions. Was this a calculated scheme? A bizarre coincidence? Or something far darker? I asked Greg to keep digging. He agreed but warned me, what we uncover might be harder to stomach than you realize. That night, I could barely look at Jane. She was her usual self, humming softly as she cooked dinner and recounting a story about a challenging client. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. If Greg's findings were accurate, then the woman sitting across from me wasn't the person I thought I knew. The next morning, I decided to track Jane myself. She left around 10 a.m., claiming she was meeting a client to finalize a project. This time, instead of letting Greg handle it, I followed her car and mine, keeping a safe distance. As expected, she hailed a taxi instead of driving to her destination. I tailed the vehicle, my heart pounding with every turn. They arrived at the same residential address Greg had mentioned, a nondescript townhouse with no signs of occupancy. Jane got out, glanced around, and entered the house. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I parked a block away. I couldn't stay in the car. I had to see what was happening inside. I approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows, and positioned myself near a side window. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw Jane inside. But she wasn't alone. She was sitting on a couch, laughing with Malik, the taxi driver I'd seen before. A few moments later, another man entered the room, holding a tray of drinks. He looked older, graying at the temples, and wore a suit that seemed out of place in such a modest setting. The three of them were talking animatedly, like old friends. Then, something changed. Jane leaned forward, placing her hand on Malik's knee. The older man smiled knowingly and settled into an armchair, observing the scene with an air of familiarity. It wasn't just infidelity. It was something orchestrated, something deliberate. This wasn't a casual affair. This was a planned, multi-layered connection involving more people than I could have imagined. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, my hands trembling as I tried to steady the lens. I didn't know what I was witnessing, but it was clear that Jane's world had spiraled far beyond what I could comprehend. I retreated before I could be spotted, returning to my car and staring blankly out the windshield. My wife wasn't just cheating. She was part of something much more elaborate. Now, I had to decide. Confront her with what I knew, or let Greg dig deeper to uncover the full extent of her secrets. Either way, there was no turning back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Jane in that townhouse, surrounded by Malik and the older man, played on a loop in my mind. Their interactions weren't just casual. They were deliberate, almost orchestrated. It was as though I had stumbled upon a scene from a play where everyone but me knew their roles. I decided to call Greg the next morning to update him on what I had seen. He listened carefully and then said something that chilled me to the bone. "That address she's been visiting, it's flagged in local records," he said. "It's tied to several suspicious activities, but nothing concrete. From what I can gather, the authorities have kept an eye on it before but never acted. It's a dead zone. Everything about it raises red flags." "What kind of activities?" I asked hesitantly. "Unregistered businesses, untraceable income streams, and ties to individuals known for, let's say, less than legal enterprises," Greg replied. "But nothing substantial enough to build a case." I gripped the phone tightly, my head spinning. "Are you saying Jane could be involved in something criminal?" "I'm saying it's possible," Greg said bluntly. "I've seen situations like this before. Affairs are messy, but when they intersect with shady operations, it gets dangerous. You need to tread carefully." That warning stayed with me all day. I couldn't fathom Jane being involved in anything illegal. She wasn't that kind of person. Or was she? The last few weeks had shown me a side of her I never thought existed. Later that evening, I decided to confront her, but indirectly. During dinner, I brought up the topic of crime in the city, hoping to gauge her reaction. "Did you hear about the crackdown on those unlicensed operations downtown?" I asked casually. Jane barely glanced up from her plate. "No, but it's about time," she said, her tone dismissive. "That area's always been sketchy." Her nonchalance was almost convincing. Almost. As the night wore on, I debated my next move. Confronting her directly felt premature. I still didn't know the full extent of her involvement. Instead, I decided to visit the townhouse myself the next day, under the guise of investigating the property. If I could figure out what was happening there, maybe I'd have more clarity. The following morning, I drove to the neighborhood, parking a block away to avoid drawing attention. The street was eerily quiet, the townhouse blending in with its surroundings. But as I approached, I noticed something strange. A black SUV was parked nearby, its tinted windows obscuring the interior. It wasn't there the day before. I felt a chill run down my spine as I walked closer. Suddenly, the door to the townhouse opened, and two men stepped out, neither of them Malik or the older man I'd seen with Jane. These men were different, dressed sharply in dark suits, their postures rigid and alert. They exchanged a few words, glanced up and down the street, and then got into the SUV. Within seconds, they were gone. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. Whatever was happening here, it was far bigger than I'd anticipated. And Jane, my Jane, was in the middle of it. I knew I couldn't face this alone anymore. It was time to confront her and finally demand the truth. That evening, I made up my mind. Whatever Jane was involved in, I couldn't keep pretending I didn't know. Every day I delayed brought more questions and fewer answers. But I knew I couldn't approach her with accusations. She was too clever for that. Instead, I'd have to lead her into revealing the truth herself. When she came home, her demeanor was the same as always, warm, collected, and affectionate. She kissed me on the cheek and asked about my day as though nothing was out of the ordinary. "I actually went for a drive today," I said casually while helping her unpack groceries. "Ended up on a street I didn't recognize. It was near an industrial area, kind of eerie." "Oh," she replied, her voice calm. But her hands froze for a split second as she placed a carton of milk in the fridge. "Yeah," I continued, watching her closely. "There was this townhouse that stood out. Looked like it didn't belong there, you know?" Her smile faltered, just barely. "Lots of odd places around the city," she said quickly, shutting the fridge door with slightly more force than necessary. I let the comment hang in the air, pretending to focus on peeling an orange. But inside, my mind was racing. She knew exactly what I was talking about. Her reaction had confirmed it. Later, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I decided to press further. "Do you ever feel like there's more to some places than meets the eye? Like they're hiding something?" Jane's head turned sharply, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she laughed. "What's with all the questions tonight? You're starting to sound like one of those conspiracy theorists." "Maybe I've just been curious lately," I said, shrugging. "You know, about how people live their double lives." Her laughter was forced this time. "Double lives? You've been watching too many movies." But the tension in her voice betrayed her words. I could tell she was growing uncomfortable, and I knew I had to stop before she became defensive. Instead, I shifted the conversation to lighter topics, letting her relax again. But in my mind, I was already planning my next step. Jane wasn't going to admit anything voluntarily. I needed more evidence. The next morning, while Jane was in the shower, I unlocked her phone. I had done this once before but found nothing incriminating. This time, I focused on her taxi app. Her ride history confirmed everything I already knew, but then I noticed something new. A recently deleted account. I stared at the screen, trying to piece it together. Why would she delete an account? And why now? Before I could investigate further, I heard the water shut off. I quickly put her phone back in its place and pretended to scroll through my own. Jane stepped into the room, her hair wrapped in a towel. She smiled at me like she always did, but for the first time, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. She wasn't just hiding something. She was actively covering her tracks. And with every passing day, I was getting closer to uncovering the full extent of her betrayal. The following day, the deleted account from Jane's phone lingered in my mind. It was a clue, a thread to pull. But if she was trying to erase her tracks, it also meant she was growing more cautious, and I had to act carefully. Greg called me in the afternoon with new information. "I've traced the townhouse," he began. "It's listed under a holding company with no clear owner. It's been rented out intermittently, but the records are murky. However, I did find something else." I leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly. "What is it?" "The SUV you mentioned?" I tracked its plates. It's registered to a company that contracts high-profile security. Bodyguards, escorts for sensitive operations, that kind of thing. My stomach dropped. Security? For what? "That's unclear," Greg admitted. "But this isn't your average affair. Whatever Jane is involved in, it's on another level." I also ran a background check on Malik, the driver you mentioned. He has no criminal record, but he's flagged in some private security databases. That means he's been observed before, but no official charges. What about Jane? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hasn't appeared in any official investigations, but her association with these people raises questions. This isn't just infidelity, it's calculated. I hung up the phone, overwhelmed by the weight of Greg's findings. Jane wasn't just cheating. She was connected to something larger, more organized. But why? What had driven her to entangle herself with these people? That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I couldn't suppress my curiosity. I decided to probe gently, careful not to raise her suspicions. You've been busy lately, I said, slicing into my meal. Is that startup project taking up a lot of your time? She nodded, chewing thoughtfully. It's a lot of work, but it's rewarding. Must be rewarding enough to keep you running all over town, I added, watching her reaction closely. You've been taking a lot of rides lately. For a moment, her fork paused midair. Then she smiled and set it down. I guess I just enjoy the convenience. Driving can be such a hassle. Her answer was smooth, rehearsed, but it didn't align with what I knew. I decided to push further. Do you ever use the same drivers? I've heard people develop favorites. Jane's eyes narrowed slightly, and she laughed, though it sounded forced. Not really. It's whoever's closest. Her lie was so blatant it almost startled me. I had the records to prove she wasn't being honest, but I bit my tongue, knowing I couldn't tip my hand yet. After dinner, I locked myself in my office under the guise of catching up on work. In reality, I was poring over the evidence Greg had sent, trying to make sense of the connections. The townhouse, the security SUV, Malik, the deleted account. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Then I noticed something I had missed earlier, a name buried in Greg's report about the security company linked to the SUV. It wasn't Jane's or Malik's, but it was familiar. It was the name of the older man I had seen with Jane in the townhouse. Suddenly, it all clicked. He wasn't just an acquaintance or a random associate. He was the linchpin in whatever Jane had gotten herself involved in. And now, I knew exactly who to watch next. The name Greg uncovered haunted me. It wasn't just familiar. It was someone I'd encountered in passing, someone Jane had mentioned casually months ago. His name was Michael Langston, a businessman with a reputation for running exclusive, under-the-radar ventures. Jane had once described him as a visionary, though I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, I realized he was at the center of everything. I asked Greg to dig deeper into Langston. By the next morning, he had answers. Langston runs several shell companies, Greg said over the phone. Most of them deal with private acquisitions, consulting, and discreet, logistical services. Nothing overtly illegal, but it's clear he operates in the gray areas of the law. What kind of logistical services? I pressed. Greg hesitated. That's harder to pin down. Some of his companies specialize in facilitating high-profile transactions, and others are rumored to offer personal services, things people want kept off the books. Whatever Jane's involvement is, it's likely tied to one of these ventures. My grip on the phone tightened. Do you think she's working for him? Possibly, Greg replied. But it doesn't explain her connection to Malik or the other drivers. My guess? She's more than an employee. Langston doesn't build casual relationships. He builds alliances. That word, alliances, sent a chill through me. If Jane was entangled in Langston's world, it wasn't just about infidelity. It was a deliberate, calculated decision to step into something far more complex. I decided to confront her that night. Not directly. I still didn't have enough to force her hand, but I planned to steer the conversation toward Langston and see how she reacted. When Jane got home, she seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. As we ate dinner, I brought him up casually. I ran into someone at the coffee shop today. I lied. They mentioned a Michael Langston. You know him, don't you? Jane's fork clattered against her plate. She quickly recovered, smiling nervously. Michael? Oh yeah, we've crossed paths. He's an interesting guy. Interesting how? I asked, feigning curiosity. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Just ambitious. Always working on something new. Why do you ask? Just curious. I said, watching her carefully. He seems like someone who knows how to get things done. Jane laughed lightly, but her eyes darted away, her discomfort clear. That's one way to put it. Her reaction confirmed my suspicions. Langston wasn't just a passing acquaintance. He was someone she was actively connected to. And from the way she deflected, she didn't want me prying into it. After dinner, I excused myself and called Greg. I need to know more about Langston's operations, I told him. Specifically, what he's using that townhouse for. Greg sighed. It's not going to be easy. The man's good at covering his tracks, but I'll see what I can do. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Jane's secrets were unraveling, but the more I learned, the less I understood. What had started as suspicions of infidelity had grown into something far darker, a web of deception, control, and hidden agendas. Whatever Langston's role was, I had a sinking feeling he wasn't just part of Jane's life. He was pulling the strings. Greg's warnings about Langston's network and Jane's evasiveness gnawed at me, but what pushed me over the edge was a stroke of pure coincidence. I hadn't planned to do anything drastic that day. I was still trying to piece everything together. Then fate intervened. I had a meeting downtown and decided to take a taxi instead of driving. I opened the app and requested a ride. When the car pulled up, I froze. It was Malik, the very driver I had been investigating. He didn't recognize me, and I made sure to keep it that way. I slid into the back seat, feigning nonchalance, though my pulse raced. This was my chance to gather information without tipping him off. Busy day? I asked casually as the ride began. Malik smiled in the rearview mirror. Always. You'd be surprised how many people rely on taxis for things other than just getting around. I kept my tone light. Oh yeah? Like what? Personal errands, discreet meetups, he said with a knowing grin. Sometimes, people just need someone who won't ask questions. I nodded, pretending to be amused. You must get to know your passengers pretty well. Some of them, yeah, Malik admitted. I've got a few regulars. There's one lady I drive all the time. Classy, but fun. She keeps things interesting. My stomach tightened. Sounds like she'd be interesting to meet. Malik chuckled. She's something, all right. Sharp, stylish, always on top of things. One of those people who could light up a room just by walking into it. I didn't need to ask who he was describing. His tone said it all. He was talking about Jane. Do you ever get curious about their lives? I asked, testing the waters. Not really my place, he said, though there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, a mix of pride and secrecy. But sometimes you can't help but notice things. I hesitated, then decided to push. Like what? Malik glanced at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. Let's just say, people like her have layers. What you see on the surface isn't always the full picture. The weight of his words hung in the air as we approached my destination. Malik had no idea who I was or how much I knew, but his cryptic comments confirmed my worst fears. Jane wasn't just hiding something. She was living a double life. When I got out of the car, I turned back to Malik. Thanks for the ride, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. By the way, what's your passenger's name? She sounds fascinating. Malik grinned. Sorry, buddy. A good driver never reveals their secrets. As he drove away, I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my mind racing. Malik's words echoed in my head, adding weight to everything Greg had uncovered. Jane's connection to Langston, the townhouse, the strange comings and goings. It was all part of a larger game. And now, I was determined to find out exactly what that game was. That night, I couldn't hold back any longer. Malik's cryptic comments had confirmed what I'd been dreading. Jane wasn't just tangled in something bigger. She was hiding an entirely different life from me. The time for subtlety was over. I waited for Jane to come home, my thoughts swirling as I prepared to confront her. When she walked through the door, her usual cheerful demeanor seemed almost mocking. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and set her purse down, humming a tune as if nothing was amiss. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light and casual. "Eventful," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I took a taxi today." That caught her attention. She paused, turning to look at me, her smile faltering just slightly. "Oh, Why didn't you drive? Wanted a change of pace, I said, leaning back in my chair. Funny thing, I got the same driver you seem to use all the time. Malik, isn't it? Jane's face froze for a split second before she quickly recovered. Oh, Malik, she said, forcing a laugh. He's great, isn't he? Always so reliable. Very, I said, my voice hardening. Reliable enough to mention how well he knows you. Says you're one of his favorite passengers. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. Cut the act, Jane, I said, standing up. I know about the townhouse. I know about Malik. I know about Langston. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. I've followed you. I've seen you with them. I know you've been meeting Malik, Langston, and God knows who else in that place. I have photos, Jane. Evidence. She backed away, her hands trembling as she held them up defensively. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're cheating on me with every man who crosses your path. Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she was going to deny everything. But then, her shoulders sagged, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. It's complicated, she whispered. Start explaining, I demanded, my arms crossed. Jane looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I wasn't cheating, not in the way you think. Langston offered me a position. It was supposed to be temporary, just a way to make extra money. What kind of position? I asked coldly. She hesitated, then looked away. A liaison, she said finally. I help facilitate introductions between his clients and, well, other people. My stomach churned. Facilitate? You mean like some kind of matchmaker? Something like that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's all about discretion. No one's supposed to know. Discretion? I spat. You're telling me you've been playing middleman for God knows. Lying to me about your entire life, and you think discretion justifies it? It wasn't supposed to go this far, she said desperately. I needed the money. I thought I could handle it, but it got out of control. Her words felt like a slap in the face. Everything I thought I knew about her, our life, our marriage, crumbled in an instant. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. Why didn't you come to me? Jane didn't answer. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. Whatever her reasons, she had chosen this path without me, and in doing so, she had shattered the trust we'd built over years. I stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the room. I needed space, needed time to process the wreckage of my marriage. But one thing was clear. The woman I thought I knew was gone, and I wasn't sure she had ever really been there at all. The hours after Jane's confession were a blur. I stayed locked in my office, pacing back and forth as her words echoed in my mind. A liaison. It felt like a sanitized label for something far uglier, something she still wasn't being entirely honest about. Around midnight, Jane knocked softly on the door. Please, she said, her voice trembling. We need to talk. I hesitated, then opened the door, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. She stepped in cautiously, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. You owe me the truth, Jane, I said, my voice firm. All of it. No more half-answers. No more deflections. She nodded, wringing her hands nervously. Okay, I'll tell you everything. She sat down, taking a deep breath before she began. Langston approached me a year ago, through one of my clients. He said he needed someone discreet, someone who could navigate sensitive situations. At first, it was just introductions, connecting people in his network. But then it escalated. Escalated how? I pressed. Her eyes darted away, and she hesitated before answering. I started managing meetings, ensuring privacy. And sometimes, those meetings were more than just business. My stomach dropped. You were arranging affairs? No, she said quickly. I never facilitated anything physical. But the people I worked with? They weren't always honest about their intentions. I didn't realize until it was too late. Why didn't you stop? I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. I thought I could manage it, she said, her voice cracking. And the money. It was more than I ever imagined. I convinced myself I was helping people, that it wasn't hurting anyone. But then Langston started demanding more. He introduced me to Malik, said he'd help with logistics. That's when it all started spiraling. I stared at her, struggling to comprehend the enormity of her betrayal. So you lied to me. Over and over. You jeopardized our marriage, our life, for this? Jane broke into sobs. I didn't know how to stop, she admitted. And I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I could keep it separate, if I could keep you out of it, we'd be okay. But we're not okay, I said sharply. Do you understand that? You've destroyed everything. How can I trust you again? She reached out, but I pulled away, the weight of her actions too much to bear. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. But her apology felt hollow. Words couldn't erase the months of lies, the web of deceit she had spun. As she left the room, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Jane's actions. It was about who she had become. And the truth was, I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. That night, I began drafting a plan. It wasn't just about ending our marriage. It was about reclaiming control of my life. And if Jane thought she could escape this unscathed, she was wrong. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of determination. Jane's confession had shattered any illusion of reconciliation. If she thought an apology would fix the gaping hole she had torn in our marriage, she was delusional. This wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the deliberate, calculated choices she made to deceive me. I called Greg and updated him on everything Jane had admitted. It sounds like Langston has her tangled in something deeper than she even realizes, Greg said grimly. You need to protect yourself, legally and emotionally. That's the plan, I said, the anger in my voice now replaced by icy resolve. What do I need to do? Greg laid it out clearly. First, I needed to gather every shred of evidence. Emails, texts, financial records, even the photos Greg had taken. It wasn't just about proving Jane's infidelity. It was about understanding the full scope of her involvement with Langston's operation. Next, I contacted a divorce lawyer. I knew I couldn't let Jane walk away without consequences. I explained everything, laying out the details of her secret life and providing the evidence I'd collected so far. My lawyer didn't mince words. This isn't just a standard divorce, she said. Depending on how deep her involvement goes, you could be looking at criminal implications. You need to be prepared for a fight. That evening, I returned home and found Jane sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at me with an expression that could have been remorse or fear. Did you mean it? She asked quietly. When you said you couldn't trust me anymore? I meant it, I replied coldly. You made your choices, Jane. Now I'm making mine. Her shoulders slumped, and she buried her face in her hands. But I felt no sympathy. She had manipulated me for months, weaving lies and hiding her true self. This wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind. Over the next few days, I played the part of a distant but civil partner. I needed her to think I was processing everything, biding my time. In reality, I was laying the groundwork for what would come next. Meanwhile, Greg continued his investigation into Langston. I've uncovered some interesting connections, he told me during a call. Langston's network includes high-profile clients, politicians, executives, people who would pay a premium for discretion. Jane may not realize it, but she's a pawn in a much larger game. Let me guess, I said bitterly. A game Langston controls. Exactly, Greg confirmed. And if you expose him, he won't go down quietly. His warning lingered in my mind. Langston wasn't just a shadowy figure in Jane's life. He was a dangerous man with the resources to protect himself. But that only strengthened my resolve. If Jane had entangled herself in his world, she would have to face the consequences. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed. A lawyer, a plan, and enough evidence to take action. But I wasn't done yet. Jane had betrayed me, yes, but Langston was the one who had pulled her into this mess. If he thought I was just another powerless bystander, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The final piece of the puzzle lay in confronting the man who had orchestrated so much of Jane's deceit, Michael Langston. I couldn't sit idly by while he remained in the shadows, manipulating my wife and countless others. If Jane was a pawn, Langston was the player, and I needed to see him face to face. I arranged the meeting through Greg. After digging through Langston's connections, Greg found an associate who worked as a consultant for one of Langston's many shell companies. With some convincing and a financial incentive, this associate set up a meeting under the guise of introducing a potential new investor. Langston agreed, likely seeing it as an opportunity to secure more influence. The meeting was held at an upscale hotel downtown. I arrived early, dressed in my sharpest suit, every nerve on edge. This wasn't just about confronting Langston. It was about reclaiming control over my life. Langston entered the private lounge right on time, exuding confidence. He was tall and sharply dressed, his presence commanding. He extended a hand, his smile polite but distant. "You must be the man my associate mentioned," he said smoothly. I shook his hand, holding his gaze. "Michael Langston," I said, my voice steady. "We finally meet." Langston raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by my tone. "Have we crossed paths before?" "In a way," I replied. "You've been crossing paths with my wife." His smile froze, his hand withdrawing as he studied me more carefully. "Your wife?" "Jane," I said, the name hanging in the air like a challenge. "She works for you, or, should I say, she's tangled in whatever operation you're running." Langston's expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't insult my intelligence," I said sharply. "I know everything about the townhouse, the drivers, the clients you shuffle in and out of your network. I've seen the pictures. I have the proof." For the first time, Langston's confident exterior cracked. He leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "You've done your homework. I'll give you that. But you're playing a dangerous game." "Not as dangerous as yours," I shot back. "You've used my wife as a pawn in your schemes. You've dragged her into something far bigger than she could handle." Langston's gaze hardened. "She came to me willingly. No one forced her hand. She came to you because you exploited her vulnerability," I said. "And now, you're going to untangle her from this mess." Langston smirked, but it was laced with menace. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" "Cut her loose," I said firmly. "End her involvement. Sever every connection. If you don't, I'll make sure every one of your clients knows just how discreet you really are." His expression darkened, his smile fading entirely. "You're threatening me." "I'm giving you a choice," I corrected. "Walk away now, and I stay quiet. Push me, and I'll bring this entire house of cards down around you." Langston stared at me for a long moment, the tension between us palpable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "You're bold. I'll give you that. But be careful, Mr. He paused, clearly fishing for my name. "You don't need my name," I said, standing. "You just need to understand that I'm not afraid of you." With that, I turned and walked out, leaving him sitting in the lounge, his face a mask of quiet fury. I didn't know if Langston would take my threat seriously, but I had made my move. The next step would be dealing with Jane, and ensuring she understood the gravity of what she had done. The confrontation with Langston had been empowering, but it also left me uneasy. A man like him wouldn't back down quietly, and I knew the fallout could reach both Jane and me. Still, I wasn't about to let fear dictate my actions. If Langston thought he could intimidate me, he was mistaken. When I got home that evening, Jane was waiting for me in the living room. Her face was pale, and her expression was a mix of guilt and desperation. She must have sensed that the balance of power in our relationship had shifted. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Finally," I replied coldly, setting my keys on the table. "Let's." She hesitated, then gestured toward the couch. "Please, just hear me out." I sat down, crossing my arms. "I've heard enough lies, Jane. It's time for the truth." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. "I've been meeting with Langston," she admitted. "I told you some of it before, but there's more. He offered me a way out." A way out of what? I asked, my tone sharp. Debt, she whispered, her voice breaking. I made some bad decisions, investments that went south. I didn't want to burden you, so I tried to handle it myself. When Langston approached me, he made it sound simple. A few introductions, some light coordination, but it wasn't simple. I stared at her, my anger barely contained. So you chose to betray me instead of trusting me. Do you even understand what you've done? Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. I know I've destroyed everything. I didn't want to drag you into my mess. I thought I could keep it separate. Separate? I said, my voice rising. You've been lying to me for over a year. You've entangled yourself with criminals, and for what? To protect your pride? It wasn't just pride, she said desperately. I was scared. Scared of losing you, of losing everything. Her words cut deeper than I expected, but they didn't soften my resolve. You've already lost me, Jane, I said quietly. What you've done, I can't forgive it. Not just the betrayal, but the sheer disregard for what we built together. She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. But I felt nothing, no sympathy, no pity. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I confronted Langston today, I continued. I told him to cut you loose. If he's smart, he'll listen. But whether he does or not, we're done. Jane's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face contorted with shock. Done? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I said firmly. I've already contacted a lawyer. The divorce papers will be ready soon. Her sobs turned into a desperate wail, but I stood my ground. She had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences. I left her there, crumpled on the couch, and walked into the guest room, where I had been sleeping for weeks. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but it felt like the final slam of our marriage ending. Tomorrow, I would take the next steps to free myself from the wreckage Jane had created. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of clarity. I had lost her long before I realized it. Now, it was time to rebuild, without her. The days following my confrontation with Jane were a whirlwind of emotions, legal meetings, and difficult decisions. True to his word, Greg continued to monitor Langston's movements. While I hadn't heard from the man since our meeting, Greg informed me that the townhouse had gone dark. No more comings and goings, no more activity tied to Malik or the other drivers. It seemed Langston had taken my warning seriously. Meanwhile, Jane withdrew into herself. She stayed in the house, avoiding me as much as possible, her once vibrant personality now a hollow shell. Part of me felt pity, but the betrayal was still too raw for forgiveness. The divorce proceedings were swift. With the evidence I'd collected, Jane had no ground to stand on. My lawyer ensured that I retained the majority of our assets, and Jane was left to face the financial mess she had created. When the papers were signed, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Our marriage, for all its good years, was now just a chapter one was closing for good. The final day came quietly. Jane packed her belongings into a taxi, thankfully not Malik's, and stood in the driveway, looking at me one last time. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said, her voice trembling, but I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't respond. I simply nodded and turned away, the weight of her choices no longer mine to bear. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I sold the house. It held too many memories, both good and bad, and moved to a smaller place on the other side of the city. Greg and I kept in touch occasionally, though his work on my case had long since concluded. One evening, I received an unexpected call from him. Thought you'd want to know, he said. Langston's operation is officially under investigation. Looks like someone tipped off the authorities. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to know. Hearing that Langston's empire was crumbling brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. As for Jane, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to a different city. She was working to rebuild her life, much like I was, though her path was undoubtedly more difficult. In the end, I found peace not through revenge, but through letting go. Jane's betrayal had taught me the importance of trust, honesty, and boundaries, lessons I would carry with me as I navigated this new chapter. One crisp autumn morning, I stood on the balcony of my new home, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the city skyline. For the first time in years, I felt free, free from lies, free from doubt, and free to move forward. This was my new beginning, and I wasn't looking back.